In the mountains of Afghanistan, where the line between life and death is measured in heartbeats, Lieutenant Sarah Mitchell faced an impossible choice. Her team leader, the man who had saved her life countless times, was now captured behind enemy lines. The military protocol was clear: no rescue mission would be authorized. The risk was too high. The odds of success were zero. But sometimes the bonds forged in combat run deeper than orders. Sometimes love and loyalty demand the impossible. This is the true story of a woman who defied every rule, every protocol, and every superior officer to march into the heart of enemy territory. Armed with nothing but her training, her courage, and an unbreakable promise she made to never leave a soldier behind, Sarah Mitchell was about to prove that some missions are worth dying for. What happened next would rewrite the military's understanding of heroism, sacrifice, and the lengths one person will go to save another. This is not just a story of war. It's a story of the human spirit pushed to its absolute limit, where failure means death, and success means changing history forever. The morning sun cast long shadows across the rocky terrain of the Hindu Kush Mountains as Lieutenant Sarah Mitchell adjusted her night vision goggles for the final time. The weight of her gear pressed against her shoulders, but she had long since stopped noticing such minor discomforts. What commanded her full attention was the valley below, where intelligence reports indicated a high-value target was hiding in a remote compound. Commander Jake Harrison, her team leader, and the man she had served under for 3 years, raised his hand in a silent signal. Sarah felt her pulse quicken, not from fear, but from the familiar rush of adrenaline that preceded every mission. She had complete trust in Harrison's judgment. He had pulled their team through 17 successful operations without losing a single member, a record that was almost unheard of in their line of work. The team consisted of 6 highly trained Navy SEALs, each handpicked by Harrison himself. Sarah was the only woman in the unit, a fact that had initially caused some raised eyebrows among the brass. But her performance in the field had quickly silenced any doubters. She could shoot as accurately as any man on the team, move just as silently, and think just as clearly under pressure. More importantly, she had something that couldn't be taught in any training facility: an intuitive understanding of when something was wrong. That morning, as they began their descent toward the target compound, that intuition was screaming warnings at her. The intelligence they had received seemed too clean, too perfect. The target location was exactly where it should be, with exactly the right number of guards in exactly the right positions. In her experience, real operations were never this neat. She caught Harrison's eye and tapped her temple twice, their agreed signal for something doesn't feel right. He nodded slightly, acknowledging her concern, but they both knew they couldn't abort the mission based on a feeling. Too much planning had gone into this operation, and too many people were counting on its success. The compound sat in a natural bowl surrounded by steep rocky walls, accessible only through a narrow mountain pass. As they moved closer, Sarah's unease grew stronger. The guards seemed too relaxed, too predictable in their patrol patterns. She had studied enough enemy positions to know that real sentries were nervous, constantly scanning the horizon, changing their routines to stay unpredictable. These men moved like actors following a script. Harrison divided the team into 2 groups. He would lead 3 men through the front entrance while Sarah and 2 others would circle around to secure the back exit. It was a standard pincer movement, one they had executed dozens of times before. As Sarah split off with her smaller group, she caught Harrison's eye one last time. There was something in his expression that she couldn't quite read, not fear, but perhaps resignation, as if he too sensed that this mission was different from all the others. Moving through the rocky terrain required every bit of Sarah's training. One misplaced foot could send loose stones cascading down the mountainside, alerting every enemy fighter in the area to their presence. She controlled her breathing, placed each step with surgical precision, and kept her weapon ready while maintaining visual contact with her 2 teammates. When they reached their designated position behind the compound, Sarah used hand signals to coordinate the final approach. Through her scope, she could see Harrison's team preparing for their assault on the front entrance. Everything appeared to be proceeding according to plan, but her sense of unease continued to grow stronger with each passing moment. The attack began with a sharp crack of sniper fire as Harrison's designated marksman took out the 2 sentries guarding the main entrance. Sarah watched through her scope as Harrison and his remaining 2 teammates rushed toward the compound's front door. That's when everything went wrong. The explosion that erupted from beneath the ground threw Harrison and his men several feet into the air. Sarah watched in horror as her team leader's body struck the rocky ground hard. The compound had been rigged with hidden charges, turning their carefully planned assault into a deadly trap. But the explosion was only the beginning. Enemy fighters emerged from concealed positions throughout the valley, positions that hadn't shown up in any of their intelligence reports. Sarah quickly realized they were facing a force at least 3 times larger than anticipated, and they were completely surrounded. The intelligence that had led them here hadn't been genuine. They had walked directly into an ambush. Sarah's training took over immediately. She began laying down, covering fire, while her 2 teammates attempted to reach Harrison's position. Through her scope, she could see that Harrison was injured, but still moving. He was trying to crawl toward cover while enemy fire kicked up dust and stone fragments all around him. The firefight was intense and chaotic. Sarah's rifle cracked repeatedly as she engaged targets throughout the valley, but for every enemy fighter she dropped, 2 more seemed to appear. Her teammates were pinned down, unable to advance toward Harrison's position without exposing themselves to concentrated enemy fire from multiple directions. Harrison had managed to drag himself behind a large boulder, but Sarah could see blood spreading across his uniform. He was hurt badly, and the enemy fighters were closing in on his position. She made a split-second decision that went against every tactical doctrine she had ever learned. She broke cover and began a solo charge across open ground toward her team leader's position. Bullets whined past her ears as she sprinted across the rocky terrain. She fired her weapon from the hip, more to keep the enemy fighters' heads down than with any hope of accuracy while running. Her 2 teammates, realizing what she was attempting, increased their rate of fire to provide whatever cover they could. Sarah reached Harrison's position just as 3 enemy fighters were approaching from the other side of the boulder. Her rifle barked 3 times in rapid succession, and all 3 men dropped. She immediately knelt beside Harrison to assess his injuries. He had taken shrapnel from the explosion in his leg and shoulder, and he was losing blood fast. "Sarah," Harrison whispered, his voice strained with pain, "you need to get out of here. This whole valley is compromised." But Sarah was already working to apply field dressings to his wounds. "We're not leaving without you, Commander. That's not how we do things." Harrison grabbed her arm with surprising strength, considering his condition. "That's an order, Lieutenant. Get your team out of here while you still can." Before Sarah could respond, the distinctive whistle of incoming mortar rounds filled the air. The enemy had brought heavy weapons into play, and their position was about to become untenable. The first round struck about 50 meters away, showering them with debris and proving that the enemy had their range. Sarah looked around desperately, trying to find a way to extract her wounded team leader, but the tactical situation was hopeless. They were surrounded, outnumbered, and under increasingly accurate fire. Her 2 remaining teammates were signaling frantically for her to fall back to their position, but she couldn't bring herself to leave Harrison behind. That's when Harrison made the decision for her. Using the last of his strength, he pushed her away from the boulder and toward her teammate's position. "Go," he shouted over the sound of gunfire. "That's a direct order. Get them home safely." Sarah hesitated for one agonizing moment, torn between her duty to follow orders and her unwillingness to abandon a teammate. Another mortar round struck even closer, and she knew she was out of time. With tears streaming down her face, she began her retreat toward her remaining teammates. The 3 surviving members of the team fought a running battle up the mountainside, pursued by enemy fighters who seemed to know the terrain better than their intelligence reports had indicated. Sarah provided rear guard coverage, turning frequently to engage their pursuers with precise rifle fire. Her marksmanship training served her well. Every shot she fired found its target, but there were simply too many enemy fighters to hold back indefinitely. When they finally reached the extraction point, Sarah looked back one last time toward the valley where they had left Harrison. She could still hear gunfire echoing off the mountain walls, but she couldn't tell if her team leader was still alive or if the shots were just enemy fighters securing the area. The helicopter extraction was completed under enemy fire, with Sarah and her two teammates barely making it aboard before the aircraft was forced to climb rapidly to escape surface-to-air missile threats. As they gained altitude, Sarah pressed her face against the small window, desperately searching the valley below for any sign of Harrison, but the compound was already disappearing into the distance. During the flight back to base, Sarah learned the full scope of what had happened. The intelligence that had led them into the ambush had been deliberately compromised. Someone had fed false information to military intelligence, information designed to lure a high-value American special operations team into a carefully prepared trap. Harrison's reputation and his team's success record had made them a particularly attractive target. But the enemy had made one crucial miscalculation. They had expected to capture or kill the entire team, but 3 members had escaped. More importantly, they had underestimated the level of loyalty and determination that existed between team members in an elite unit like theirs. What they had intended as a complete victory had instead created something far more dangerous. A highly trained soldier with both the skills and the motivation to attempt the impossible. When they landed at the forward operating base, Sarah was immediately debriefed by intelligence officers who wanted every detail about the failed mission. She provided complete and accurate information about enemy positions, weapons, and tactics, but she kept her emotional responses carefully controlled. Inside, however, she was already beginning to formulate a plan that would have horrified her superior officers if they had known what she was thinking. The official military response was swift and predictable. Within hours, satellite reconnaissance confirmed that Harrison had been captured alive and was being held at a location approximately 15 miles deeper into enemy territory than their original target. A rescue mission was briefly considered but quickly deemed impossible due to the strength of enemy forces in the area and the likelihood that any rescue attempt would result in Harrison's immediate execution. Sarah sat in her small quarters that night, staring at a map of the region and running calculations in her head. The official military assessment was probably correct. A conventional rescue mission would likely fail and result in additional casualties. But Sarah wasn't thinking about a conventional rescue mission. She was thinking about something that had never been attempted before, something so audacious that the enemy would never see it coming. The bond between Sarah and Harrison went beyond the normal relationship between team members. He had saved her life on 2 separate occasions, once by throwing himself on top of her when a grenade had landed nearby, and once by carrying her to safety when she had been wounded by sniper fire. More than that, he had believed in her abilities when others had doubted, had recommended her for advanced training, and had created opportunities for her to prove herself in the field. Now, it was her turn to save him, regardless of the cost. As she studied the map and began to form her plan, Sarah knew that she was contemplating something that would end her military career and quite possibly her life. But some debts could only be repaid with action, and some promises could only be kept by risking everything. The next morning would bring meetings with superior officers, official reports, and the bureaucratic machinery that would ultimately write off Harrison as an acceptable loss in an ongoing conflict. But Sarah had already decided that she wouldn't be attending those meetings. She had different plans that would require all of her training, all of her courage, and all of her determination. Harrison was alive. He was in enemy hands, and he was counting on his team to bring him home. The fact that the military had declared such a mission impossible only meant that she would have to accomplish the impossible. It wouldn't be the first time. The briefing room at Forward Operating Base Chapman felt like a tomb as Sarah sat across from Colonel Marcus Webb, the commanding officer who had the unenviable task of explaining why the United States military would not be attempting to rescue Commander Jake Harrison. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting harsh shadows across the faces of the assembled officers, all of whom avoided making direct eye contact with Sarah. Colonel Webb's voice was measured and professional as he outlined the intelligence assessment. Harrison was being held at a heavily fortified compound deep in Taliban-controlled territory, surrounded by an estimated 200 enemy fighters. The location was accessible only through a narrow mountain pass that was under constant surveillance. Any rescue attempt would require a full battalion-sized operation, which would inevitably result in Harrison's execution long before American forces could reach him. Sarah listened to the briefing with growing frustration, her hands clenched tightly in her lap. Every tactical assessment was presented as if Harrison were already dead. Every casualty estimate treated him as an acceptable loss in a larger context of the war. The men speaking had never served alongside Harrison, had never seen him risk his own life to save his teammates, had never experienced the absolute trust that came from knowing someone would die before they would abandon you. The prisoner exchange negotiations are our best hope, Colonel Webb concluded, sliding a classified folder across the table towards Sarah. We're prepared to trade 5 high-value Taliban prisoners currently held at Guantanamo Bay for Commander Harrison's release. The Taliban leadership has indicated they might be willing to consider such an exchange. Sarah opened the folder and immediately understood why the military was pessimistic about the prisoner exchange option. The 5 Taliban prisoners were senior commanders, men whose release would significantly strengthen enemy operations throughout the region. Even if the exchange were approved at the highest levels of government, it would take weeks or months to negotiate the details. Harrison didn't have weeks or months. "With respect, sir," Sarah said, her voice carefully controlled, "what makes you think the Taliban will keep Harrison alive long enough for these negotiations to conclude? They captured him for propaganda purposes. Once they've extracted whatever intelligence value they can from him, they'll execute him publicly to demonstrate their power." Colonel Webb's expression softened slightly, and Sarah realized that he wasn't unsympathetic to Harrison's plight. He was simply being realistic about the options available to him. "Lieutenant Mitchell, I understand your frustration. Commander Harrison is a valuable officer and a good man, but we cannot risk additional lives on a rescue mission that has virtually no chance of success. What about a small team insertion?" Sarah pressed. 4 or 5 operators moving at night, using the terrain to avoid the main enemy concentrations. The Taliban won't be expecting a small team approach. They'll be watching for a large-scale assault. Captain Rodriguez, the intelligence officer who had been silent during most of the briefing, shook his head. "We've analyzed every possible approach, Lieutenant. The compound where Harrison is being held is essentially a fortress carved into the mountainside. There's only one way in and one way out, and both are under constant guard. Even if a small team could reach the compound undetected, which is highly unlikely, they would be trapped inside with no possibility of extraction." Sarah studied the aerial photographs, and satellite imagery spread across the table. The enemy compound was indeed formidable, built into a natural cave system that had been expanded and fortified over decades of warfare. The single entrance was protected by multiple defensive positions, and the surrounding terrain offered little cover for an approaching force. But Sarah saw something that the intelligence analyst had missed. Her years of field experience had taught her to look beyond the obvious defensive positions and consider the natural features of the landscape. The compound was built on the side of a mountain that rose nearly vertical for several hundred feet above the cave entrance. No military planner would expect an attack from that direction because it appeared impossible to scale. "Sir, has anyone considered an approach from above?" Sarah asked, pointing to the steep mountainside visible in the satellite photos. If someone could climb to the top of the mountain and rappel down to the compound, they could bypass all of the defensive positions. Colonel Webb looked at the photographs more carefully, then shook his head. "Lieutenant, that mountain face is nearly vertical. It would take a world-class rock climber to make that ascent, and even then, they would be completely exposed to enemy fire during the descent. It's not a viable option, but it's the only option they won't be expecting, Sarah insisted. Every conventional approach has been tried and failed in this terrain. The Taliban know how to defend against helicopters, ground assaults, and airborne insertions. But they've never had to defend against someone rappelling down from directly above their position. The room fell silent as the assembled officers considered Sarah's suggestion. Finally, Colonel Webb spoke. Even if such an approach were possible, which I seriously doubt, we don't have anyone qualified to attempt it. Rock climbing skills aren't part of standard SEAL training, and we don't have time to bring in civilian experts. Sarah took a deep breath, knowing that her next words would change everything. Sir, I have extensive rock climbing experience. I spent 2 years as a civilian climbing instructor before enlisting, and I've maintained those skills throughout my military career. I can make that climb. The silence that followed Sarah's statement was deafening. Colonel Webb stared at her as if she had just volunteered to fly to the moon. Captain Rodriguez looked down at his notes, clearly uncomfortable with the direction the conversation was taking. Finally, Colonel Webb found his voice. Lieutenant Mitchell, what you're suggesting isn't a military operation. It's suicide. Even if you could make the climb, which is doubtful, you would be a single operator going up against 200 enemy fighters. The mission parameters are completely outside acceptable risk levels. Commander Harrison is worth the risk, Sarah replied without hesitation. He wouldn't abandon any of us, and we can't abandon him. Colonel Webb's expression hardened. Lieutenant, your emotional attachment to your team leader is understandable, but it's also compromising your judgment. The decision has been made. We will pursue diplomatic options for Commander Harrison's release while continuing normal operations in this sector. You are ordered to stand down and prepare for reassignment to a new team. Sarah felt something cold settle in her stomach as she realized the full implications of Colonel Webb's words. The military was writing Harrison off, treating him as an acceptable casualty while they focused on other priorities. The man who had saved her life, who had trained her and trusted her and created opportunities for her to prove herself, was being abandoned to his fate in an enemy prison. I need some time to process this information, sir, Sarah said, her voice steady despite the turmoil she felt inside. Of course, Colonel Webb replied. Take the rest of the day. Report to Captain Rodriguez tomorrow morning for your reassignment briefing. Sarah stood and saluted, then walked out of the briefing room with measured steps that gave no hint of the desperate plan that was already forming in her mind. She made her way back to her quarters, nodding politely to the various personnel she encountered along the way, giving no indication that she was contemplating the most audacious military action in modern history. Once alone in her room, Sarah began pulling items from her personal gear locker. Her civilian rock climbing equipment was stored in a duffel bag at the bottom of the locker, gear she had brought with her on deployment more out of habit than any expectation that she would need it. Now, as she examined her climbing harness, ropes, and hardware, she realized that these tools might be Harrison's only hope for survival. Sarah spread a detailed topographical map across her small desk and began planning a route that no military tactician would ever consider viable. The approach would require a 20-mile hike through enemy-controlled territory, followed by a technical rock climb that would challenge her skills even under ideal conditions. She would be carrying full combat gear, plus climbing equipment, moving alone through terrain where discovery would mean immediate death. But the more she studied the problem, the more convinced she became that it could work. The Taliban had positioned their defenses to repel conventional military assaults, but they had never faced an opponent who could approach from above. If she could reach the top of the mountain undetected and rappel down to the compound under cover of darkness, she might be able to reach Harrison before the guards realized what was happening. The biggest challenge would be the extraction. Even if she could reach Harrison and help him escape from the compound, they would still need to evade pursuit across 20 miles of hostile territory while Harrison was injured and possibly unable to move quickly. Sarah studied the map for hours, looking for every possible escape route, every cave or valley that might provide concealment, every stream or ridge that might throw off pursuing forces. As the sun set outside her small window, Sarah made her final decision. She couldn't live with herself if she allowed Harrison to die in captivity when there was even a remote possibility of saving him. The military had made their choice based on acceptable risk levels and strategic priorities, but Sarah had different priorities. Her loyalty was to the man who had earned her respect and trust through 3 years of shared danger. Sarah began writing a letter that she would leave behind to explain her actions. She knew that what she was planning would be viewed as desertion, insubordination, and reckless endangerment. Her military career was over regardless of whether she succeeded or failed. But some things were more important than careers, and some promises were worth any sacrifice to keep. The letter was addressed to Colonel Webb, and Sarah chose her words carefully. She explained that she was not acting out of emotional attachment or poor judgment, but out of a professional obligation to her team leader. She detailed her analysis of the tactical situation and her assessment of the rescue plan's viability. Most importantly, she made it clear that she was acting alone and that no other personnel should be held responsible for her decision. Sarah sealed the letter and placed it on her pillow where it would be found when she failed to report for her reassignment briefing. By then, she would already be deep in enemy territory, either succeeding in the most improbable rescue mission in military history or dying in the attempt. She spent the remaining hours before midnight preparing her equipment with meticulous care. Every piece of gear had to serve multiple purposes since she would be carrying everything on her back across difficult terrain. She selected her most reliable rifle, her backup sidearm, enough ammunition for a sustained firefight, medical supplies for treating Harrison's wounds, climbing gear rated for her body weight plus Harrison's, and enough food and water for a 3-day operation. The total weight of her equipment exceeded 60 pounds, more than she had ever carried on a climbing expedition, but there was no alternative. Every item was essential either for reaching Harrison or for getting both of them out alive. Sarah tested the balance and fit of her pack repeatedly, adjusting the weight distribution until she was confident she could move quickly despite the load. At exactly midnight, Sarah Mitchell slipped out of her quarters and made her way to the base perimeter. She had studied the guard rotations and patrol schedules for weeks, not with any intention of deserting, but simply as part of her professional awareness of base security. Now that knowledge served a different purpose as she avoided the sentries and surveillance cameras that might have detected her departure. The mountain wilderness beyond the base was dark and silent, broken only by the distant sound of wind through the rocky peaks. Sarah checked her compass and GPS device one final time, then began the longest walk of her life. 20 miles through enemy territory, followed by the most difficult climb she had ever attempted, all to reach a man who might already be dead. But Harrison wasn't dead. Sarah was sure of that, with an intuition that went beyond logic or analysis. Somewhere ahead in the darkness, her team leader was waiting for rescue, trusting in the promise that no American soldier would ever be left behind. Sarah had made that promise 3 years ago when she joined Harrison's team, and she intended to keep it regardless of the cost. The night was cold and clear, perfect conditions for a long-distance infiltration. Sarah moved with the silent efficiency that had been drilled into her through years of training, placing each step carefully to avoid loose stones or branches that might give away her position. She had become a ghost moving through hostile territory, invisible and determined, carrying with her the hopes of a captured comrade and the weight of an impossible mission. Behind her, the lights of the forward operating base gradually faded into the distance. Ahead lay 20 miles of the most dangerous terrain in Afghanistan, guarded by an enemy that had no mercy for captured Americans. But Sarah Mitchell was no longer thinking about the dangers or the odds of success. She was thinking only about the promise she had made and the man who was counting on her to keep it. The rescue of Commander Jake Harrison had begun. The Afghan mountains at night were a world of shadows and silence, broken only by the whisper of wind through rocky crevices and the distant howl of wolves echoing across the valleys. Sarah Mitchell moved through this landscape like a ghost, her footsteps silent on the stone pathways worn smooth by centuries of use. She had been walking for 6 hours, covering nearly 12 miles of treacherous terrain while avoiding the known patrol routes and observation posts that dotted the region. Every muscle in her body ached under the weight of her equipment, but Sarah pushed the discomfort aside and focused on the task ahead. The GPS device on her wrist showed that she was making good time despite the difficult conditions. More importantly, she had encountered no signs of enemy activity since leaving the vicinity of the base. The Taliban fighters in this region were confident in their control of the territory, perhaps too confident to maintain the kind of vigilant security that might have detected her approach. Sarah paused at the crest of a ridge to check her position and scan the valley ahead. Through her night vision goggles, she could see the infrared signatures of several buildings clustered around what appeared to be a small village. According to her intelligence briefings, this settlement was known to be sympathetic to Taliban forces and serve as a supply depot for fighters operating in the surrounding mountains. The village lay directly across her planned route to Harrison's prison location. Sarah could have added several miles to her journey by circling around the settlement, but time was a critical factor. Every hour she spent in the field increased the likelihood that her absence would be discovered, triggering a massive search operation that would doom any chance of rescuing Harrison. She made the decision to move directly through the village, trusting in her training and the darkness to conceal her passage. As Sarah approached the outskirts of the village, she could hear the low murmur of voices from one of the buildings and smell the smoke from cooking fires that had been banked for the night. Dogs barked occasionally in the distance, but they seemed to be responding to normal nighttime sounds rather than detecting her presence. She moved from shadow to shadow, using walls and abandoned equipment as cover while she worked her way through the narrow streets. Halfway through the village, Sarah froze as she heard footsteps approaching from around the corner of a building ahead. She pressed herself against a stone wall and controlled her breathing while two men walked past, conversing in low voices in what sounded like Pashto. They were carrying rifles and appeared to be conducting some kind of security patrol, though their casual attitude suggested they weren't expecting any trouble. Sarah waited until the patrol had disappeared around another corner before continuing her movement through the village. She was almost clear of the settlement when disaster nearly struck. A dog that had been sleeping in the doorway of a house suddenly woke and began barking loudly at her presence. The animal's sharp barks echoed off the stone walls, seeming impossibly loud in the quiet night. Sarah immediately dropped into a crouch behind a stack of firewood and prepared for the possibility that the barking would draw unwanted attention. She could hear voices from several buildings as people woke up to investigate the disturbance. A door opened somewhere nearby, and footsteps approached her hiding place. An elderly man emerged from one of the houses, carrying a small flashlight and calling softly to the dog in Pashto. Sarah remained perfectly still as the man walked within 10 feet of her position, close enough that she could have reached out and touched him. The dog continued barking for several more minutes before finally settling down, apparently satisfied that the perceived threat had moved on. The man spent another few minutes looking around the area before returning to his house, leaving Sarah free to complete her passage through the village. She moved even more carefully now, knowing that the residents were alert and might be watching for any unusual activity. It took her nearly an hour to cover the final few hundred yards to the edge of the settlement, but she finally emerged into open country without being detected. The remainder of Sarah's approach to the target area took her through increasingly difficult terrain as she climbed higher into the mountains. The paths became steeper and more treacherous, forcing her to use her hands as well as her feet to navigate some sections. The thin air at high altitude made every breath a conscious effort, and the weight of her pack seemed to increase with each passing hour. As dawn approached, Sarah could see the first hints of gray light appearing on the eastern horizon. She needed to find a secure hiding place where she could rest during the daylight hours and observe the enemy compound without being detected. According to her map, she was now less than 2 miles from Harrison's prison location, close enough to see the mountain peak where the compound was situated. Sarah found what she was looking for in a cluster of large boulders that formed a natural cave about 50 feet above the main valley floor. The position offered excellent concealment while providing a clear view of the approaches to the enemy compound. She squeezed herself and her equipment into the narrow space between the rocks and settled in to wait for nightfall. Through her binoculars, Sarah could see the compound built into the mountainside across the valley. The intelligence reports had been accurate. The facility was essentially a fortress carved from the living rock, with defensive positions covering every possible approach route. She counted at least 30 guards visible around the perimeter, and she knew there were probably twice that many inside the compound itself. But Sarah also saw what the intelligence analyst had missed. The mountain face above the compound was indeed nearly vertical, but it wasn't completely smooth. There were cracks and ledges that would provide handholds for an experienced climber, and several small terraces that could serve as rest points during the ascent. More importantly, the guards were focused on watching the valley approaches rather than scanning the cliff face above their position. Sarah spent the day studying the compound through her binoculars, memorizing the layout of the defensive positions and the timing of the guard rotations. She identified what appeared to be the main prison building, a structure carved deep into the mountainside with only one visible entrance. If Harrison was being held anywhere in the compound, it would most likely be in that building. The biggest challenge would be locating Harrison within the prison structure once she reached it. The building appeared to have multiple levels and dozens of rooms, any of which could be serving as a cell. Sarah would have to search systematically while avoiding the guards, a task that would require both speed and stealth. She began planning a search pattern that would allow her to cover the most likely areas as quickly as possible. As the sun set behind the western peaks, Sarah prepared for the most dangerous part of her mission. She checked and rechecked her climbing equipment, making sure every piece was in perfect working order. Her rifle was cleaned and loaded with a full magazine. Her sidearm was readily accessible, and her medical kit was positioned where she could reach it quickly if Harrison needed immediate attention. The approach to the base of the mountain required another hour of careful movement through rocky terrain. Sarah had to cross 2 stream beds and navigate around several enemy observation posts, but her day-long surveillance had revealed the blind spots in their coverage. By 10 o'clock that night, she was crouched at the bottom of the cliff face, looking up at what appeared to be an impossible climb. The first 100 feet were the most difficult because the rock face was nearly smooth, offering only tiny cracks and irregularities for handholds. Sarah had to rely entirely on her finger strength and climbing technique, moving slowly upward, one careful placement at a time. The weight of her pack made every move more difficult, threatening to pull her backward off the cliff face. But as she climbed higher, the rock face began to offer better holds. Ancient weathering had created a series of horizontal cracks that served as ledges, and Sarah was able to establish a steady rhythm of movement. She climbed in the style she had learned during her civilian mountaineering days, testing each hold carefully before committing her full weight to it. The physical demands of the climb were enormous. Sarah's forearms burned with the constant strain of gripping the rock, and her shoulders ached from supporting the weight of her equipment. Sweat dripped into her eyes despite the cold mountain air, and she had to pause frequently to shake the fatigue from her hands and arms. Halfway up the cliff face, Sarah encountered her first major obstacle. A section of the rock had fallen away at some point in the past, leaving a smooth, vertical wall with no visible handholds. She was forced to traverse laterally for nearly 50 feet before finding a crack system that would allow her to continue upward. The detour cost her valuable time and energy, but there was no alternative route available. As Sarah climbed higher, she began to hear sound from the compound below, voices of the guards, the slam of doors, the occasional bark of orders. She was getting close to her target, but the most dangerous part of the mission was still ahead. Once she reached the top of the cliff, she would have to rappel down to the compound level while remaining undetected by the sentries below. The final pitch of the climb was the most exposed, taking Sarah across a section of rock that was visible from several guard positions. If anyone happened to look up, she moved as quickly as she dared, knowing that speed was now more important than stealth. Her muscles screamed in protest as she pulled herself up the last few feet to the top of the cliff, but she finally collapsed onto the narrow ledge that marked the summit. Sarah allowed herself exactly 2 minutes to rest and recover from the climb before beginning her preparation for the rappel descent. She anchored her rope to the most solid rock formation she could find and tested the system repeatedly to make sure it would hold her weight plus Harrison's if necessary. This would be her only way back up the cliff face, and any failure in the anchor system would trap both of them in the compound. The rappel down to the compound level was terrifying in its own way. Sarah had to descend nearly 200 feet of vertical cliff face while wearing full combat gear and try to remain invisible to the guards below. She moved in short sections, pausing frequently to listen for any sounds that might indicate she had been detected. When Sarah finally touched down on the narrow ledge that led to the compound entrance, she felt a surge of adrenaline that made her hands shake slightly. She had accomplished what military experts had declared impossible. She had reached the enemy compound undetected and was now in position to attempt Harrison's rescue. But the most dangerous part of the mission was just beginning. The compound entrance was carved into the living rock of the mountainside, protected by heavy wooden doors bound with iron. Sarah could see light seeping around the edges of the doors, and she could hear voices from within. According to her observations from across the valley, there should be 2 guards posted just inside the entrance, but their exact positions were unknown. Sarah drew her sidearm and attached a sound suppressor, knowing that any gunfire would alert the entire compound to her presence. She would have to rely on stealth and precision to eliminate the guards silently, then locate and extract Harrison before the alarm could be raised. The success of the entire mission now depended on the next few minutes of action. She placed her hand on the ancient iron handle of the compound door and took a deep breath. Somewhere inside this fortress carved from stone, Jake Harrison was waiting for rescue, possibly injured, certainly weakened by his captivity, but hopefully still alive. Sarah had crossed 20 miles of enemy territory and climbed a mountain that military experts said was impossible to scale. Now she was about to find out if her impossible mission could actually succeed. The door creaked softly as Sarah pushed it open just wide enough to peer inside. The interior of the compound was dimly lit by oil lamps, casting dancing shadows on the rough stone walls. She could see a long corridor stretching deeper into the mountain, with several doorways leading off to side chambers. 2 guards sat at a small table near the entrance, playing cards and talking quietly in Pashto. Sarah slipped through the doorway like a shadow, her weapon raised and ready. The guards never knew what hit them. 2 precise shots from her suppressed pistol, and both men slumped forward across their card table. Sarah caught one of the men before he could fall to the floor, lowering him silently to avoid any noise that might alert other guards deeper in the compound. She was inside. The impossible rescue mission had become possible, and Jake Harrison's salvation was now just a matter of finding him among the maze of tunnels and chambers that made up his prison. Sarah moved deeper into the compound, every sense alert for danger, knowing that she was walking into the heart of enemy territory with no backup and no hope of reinforcement if things went wrong. But she had made it this far against impossible odds, and she wasn't about to stop now. Harrison was somewhere in this mountain fortress, and Sarah Mitchell was going to find him and bring him home, regardless of what stood in her way. The interior of the compound was a labyrinth of tunnels carved from solid rock, each passage leading deeper into the mountain's heart. Sarah moved through the corridors with deliberate silence, her suppressed pistol ready as she navigated by the dim light of oil lamps mounted on the walls. The air was thick with the smell of smoke, unwashed bodies, and something else she couldn't identify, the stench of fear and desperation that seemed to permeate the stone walls themselves. Each doorway Sarah passed required a careful approach. She would pause, listen for voices or movement, then quickly check the interior before moving on. Most of the rooms appeared to be living quarters for the guards, filled with bedrolls, personal belongings, and weapons. Others served as storage areas for supplies and ammunition. But none contained what she was looking for, the American prisoner who had been captured during the ambush. Sarah's mental map of the compound was based on her observations from across the valley, but the interior layout was proving more complex than she had anticipated. The tunnels branched and interconnected in ways that weren't visible from the outside, creating a three-dimensional maze that could easily confuse an intruder. She marked her route carefully, using small scratches on the wall to ensure she could find her way back to the entrance, if necessary. The sound of approaching footsteps forced Sarah to duck into an empty storage room, just as two guards walked past her hiding place. They were speaking in low voices, and, while Sarah couldn't understand their words, their tones suggested routine conversation rather than any kind of alert. Her elimination of the entrance guards hadn't been discovered yet, but she knew it was only a matter of time before someone noticed their absence. Deeper in the compound, Sarah began to hear different sounds. The low murmur of multiple voices, the clank of metal on metal, and what sounded like someone coughing repeatedly. The prisoner holding area was somewhere ahead, and Harrison might be just minutes away from rescue. But the closer she got to her objective, the more guards she encountered, and the more difficult it became to move undetected. Sarah was forced to eliminate 3 more guards as she worked her way through the compound, each time using her suppressed pistol to drop them silently. The bodies were becoming a problem. She couldn't hide them all effectively, and eventually someone would notice that guards were missing from their posts. Her window of opportunity was closing rapidly, and she still hadn't located Harrison's cell. The breakthrough came when Sarah heard a voice speaking English from behind a heavy wooden door reinforced with iron bars. The voice was weak and hoarse, but she recognized it immediately. Jake Harrison was trying to communicate with someone, probably another prisoner. Sarah's heart raced as she realized she had finally found her objective after hours of searching through the mountain fortress. Sarah approached the door carefully, listening to identify how many people were in the room and whether any guard were present. She could hear Harrison speaking to at least one other person, but the voices were too quiet to make out the words. There didn't appear to be any guards in the immediate area, but Sarah knew that could change at any moment. The door was secured with a heavy wooden bar that required both hands to lift. Sarah holstered her weapon and carefully raised the bar, wincing as the ancient wood creaked under its own weight. She set the bar aside as quietly as possible, then drew her pistol again before pushing the door open. The sight that greeted Sarah was both heartening and horrifying. Harrison was alive, sitting with his back against the stone wall of what was clearly a prison cell. But he was in terrible condition. His face was swollen and bruised, his uniform was torn and blood-stained, and his left leg was splinted with crude wooden boards. Next to him sat another American, a pilot from his uniform insignia, who appeared to be in even worse condition. Harrison looked up as the door opened, expecting to see one of his captors. When he saw Sarah instead, his expression went through a rapid series of changes: surprise, disbelief, hope, and, finally, concern. "Sarah," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "What the hell are you doing here?" "Getting you out of here, sir," Sarah replied, already moving to help Harrison to his feet. "Can you walk?" Harrison tested his injured leg and winced in pain. "I can manage, but not quickly." "Sarah, this is Captain Williams. He was shot down 3 days ago. We can't leave him behind." Sarah looked at the pilot, whose injuries were clearly severe. He had taken a bullet in the shoulder and another in the abdomen, and he was barely conscious. Moving both men would be extremely difficult, but Harrison was right. They couldn't abandon another American prisoner. "Can you help me get him up?" Sarah asked Harrison, moving to support Captain Williams from one side. Together, they managed to get the injured pilot to his feet, though he immediately slumped against Harrison for support. "How did you get in here?" Harrison asked as they began moving toward the door. The military said a rescue was impossible. "They were right," Sarah replied. "It was impossible. I did it anyway." Harrison actually smiled at that response, despite their desperate situation. "I should have known you wouldn't follow orders when they went against your conscience. How are we getting out?" Sarah explained her route, while she helped Harrison support Captain Williams. The injured pilot was semi-conscious and unable to bear his own weight, making their movement slow and difficult. They would have to retrace Sarah's path through the compound, then climb up the cliff face using the rope she had anchored at the top. It would be the most difficult extraction in military history, assuming they could even make it out of the compound alive. The first obstacle came almost immediately. As they reached the main corridor, Sarah heard voices approaching from the direction of the compound entrance. Someone had discovered the dead guards, and the alarm was about to be raised. Sarah quickly guided Harrison and Williams into a side passage just as several Taliban fighters ran past, shouting orders and beginning a systematic search of the compound. "They know someone's inside," Harrison whispered. "We're not going to make it out the way you came in." Sarah had already reached the same conclusion. The main entrance would be heavily guarded now, and trying to move two injured men through a complex of alerted enemy fighters was virtually impossible. She needed an alternative escape route, something the Taliban wouldn't expect. "Is there another way out of this place?" Sarah asked. "Emergency exit, ventilation shaft, anything?" Harrison thought for a moment. "There's a tunnel system that connects to a cave on the north side of the mountain. The guards use it to move supplies without being seen from the valley. But I don't know if we can reach it. It's deep in the compound, and we have to pass through their command center." "Better than trying to shoot our way through the main entrance," Sarah replied. "Can you guide us there?" Harrison nodded, though Sarah could see the effort it was costing him to remain upright while supporting Captain Williams. They began moving deeper into the compound, away from the main entrance where the search was intensifying. Every few minutes they had to stop and hide while guards ran past, the Taliban fighters growing more agitated as they realized the scope of the security breach. The journey to the alternate exit took nearly an hour, during which Sarah had to eliminate 4 more guards who came too close to their hiding places. Each gunshot, even suppressed, seemed impossibly loud in the confines of the stone tunnels. Sarah knew it was only a matter of time before their presence was detected through sound alone. Captain Williams was deteriorating rapidly. His breathing was becoming more labored, and he was losing consciousness for longer periods. Sarah realized that even if they managed to escape the compound, the pilot might not survive the journey back to friendly territory. But she couldn't bring herself to abandon him, not when Harrison had made it clear that leaving the man behind wasn't an option. The command center was exactly where Harrison had said it would be, a large chamber carved from the mountain's heart and filled with communications equipment, maps, and weapons. More importantly, it was occupied by at least a dozen Taliban fighters who were coordinating the search for the intruders. Sarah assessed the tactical situation and realized they couldn't go around this obstacle. The only route to the alternate exit led directly through the command center. "We're going to have to fight our way through," Sarah told Harrison. "When I start shooting, get Williams to that doorway on the far side of the room. I'll provide cover." Harrison looked at her with an expression of profound gratitude and concern. "Sarah, there are too many of them. Even if you take down half the room, the rest will kill all of us." "Maybe," Sarah replied, checking her remaining ammunition. "But it's the only chance we have. On my signal, move." Sarah took a deep breath and stepped into the doorway of the command center, her rifle at the ready. She had trained for situations like this, close-quarters combat against multiple opponents in confined spaces, but she had never faced odds this steep while protecting 2 wounded men who couldn't move quickly. The first burst from Sarah's rifle dropped 3 Taliban fighters before they could react. The command center erupted in chaos as the remaining men scrambled for weapons and cover while trying to identify where the attack was coming from. Sarah moved and fired with mechanical precision, each shot carefully aimed to maximize effect while conserving her limited ammunition. Harrison dragged Captain Williams toward the far exit as quickly as his injured leg would allow, while Sarah provided covering fire from a position behind an overturned table. Enemy bullets sparked off the stone walls around her, filling the air with chips of rock and the acrid smell of gunpowder. She could hear shouts echoing from other parts of the compound as more Taliban fighters responded to the sound of battle. By the time Harrison reached the exit doorway with Williams, Sarah had eliminated 7 of the 12 fighters in the command center, but the remaining 5 had found good defensive positions and were keeping her pinned down with sustained automatic weapons fire. She was running low on ammunition and would soon be forced to rely on her sidearm for the remainder of the fight. "Sarah, we're through," Harrison called from the doorway. "Come on." Sarah fired her last rifle magazine in a sustained burst that forced the enemy fighters to take cover, then sprinted across the command center toward Harrison's position. Bullets followed her across the open ground, and she felt one round tug at the fabric of her uniform without penetrating. She dove through the doorway just as a grenade exploded behind her, filling the command center with smoke and debris. The alternate exit tunnel was narrow and dark, lit only by Sarah's flashlight. Harrison was already moving ahead with Williams, but their progress was painfully slow. Behind them, Sarah could hear the Taliban fighters regrouping and beginning to pursue them through the tunnel system. The explosion had probably collapsed part of the command center, but it wouldn't stop their pursuers for long. "How much farther to the exit?" Sarah asked as she helped Harrison support the semi-conscious pilot. "Maybe 200 meters," Harrison replied, breathing heavily from the exertion. "But, Sarah, even if we make it outside, they'll have fighters positioned around the entire mountain by now. We'll be walking into another ambush." Sarah considered their options as they continued through the tunnel. Harrison was right. The Taliban would have anticipated that the intruders might try to escape through alternate routes, and they would have positioned fighters to cover all possible exit points. But staying in the tunnel system wasn't viable either, since they were being actively pursued by an unknown number of enemy fighters. "We'll have to take our chances outside," Sarah decided. "At least in the open, we'll have room to maneuver. In these tunnels, they can trap us and use grenades to collapse the whole system." The exit turned out to be a natural cave opening on the north face of the mountain, about halfway down from the summit. As Harrison had predicted, Sarah could see the muzzle flashes of weapons positioned around the mountainside. The Taliban had indeed anticipated their escape route and were waiting for them to emerge. But Sarah had one advantage that the enemy fighters couldn't have anticipated. Her rope was still anchored at the top of the mountain, and while the Taliban were watching the obvious exit points, they probably weren't expecting anyone to climb back up the cliff face. It would be an enormous risk with 2 injured men, but it might be their only chance of avoiding the ambush waiting outside the cave. "Change of plans," Sarah told Harrison as they reached the cave entrance. "We're going back up." Harrison looked at her as if she had lost her mind. "Sarah, Williams can barely stand, and I can hardly walk. There's no way we can make that climb." "There's no way we can survive walking into that ambush either," Sarah replied. "I'll rig a harness system and haul you both up. It's crazy, but it might work." Behind them in the tunnel, Sarah could hear their pursuers getting closer. She had perhaps 10 minutes to set up a rope system and get all 3 of them back up the cliff face before the Taliban fighters reached the cave entrance. It would require every bit of her climbing expertise and more luck than anyone had a right to expect. But Jake Harrison was alive. They had rescued another American prisoner, and Sarah Mitchell had already accomplished the impossible once tonight. As she began rigging the rope system that would either save all their lives or kill them all in the attempt, she allowed herself to believe that the impossible might be possible one more time. The rope system Sarah Mitchell rigged at the cave entrance was unlike anything taught in any military manual. Using her climbing harness as an anchor point and every piece of hardware she carried, she created a complex pulley arrangement that would allow her to haul both injured men up the cliff face while climbing herself. The physics were questionable, and the safety margins were non-existent, but it was their only alternative to walking into certain death outside the cave. Captain Williams was barely conscious, his breathing shallow, and labored from his abdominal wound. Sarah strapped him into an improvised harness made from climbing webbing and her own equipment straps, then secured him to the main rope with multiple connection points. Harrison's injured leg made him unable to climb independently, but he was alert enough to help control his own ascent and assist with managing Williams during the climb. "This is insane, Sarah," Harrison whispered as she completed her preparations. "Even if the rope system works, we'll be completely exposed on the cliff face. They'll pick us off like targets at a shooting range." "Maybe," Sarah replied while checking her knots one final time. "But they're not expecting us to go up. They're watching all the routes down the mountain. Sometimes the most insane plan is the one that works because nobody sees it coming." The sound of approaching footsteps in the tunnel behind them ended the discussion. Their Taliban pursuers were less than 2 minutes away, and Sarah could hear voices echoing off the stone walls as the fighters coordinated their assault on the cave entrance. Once the enemy reached the cave, the 3 Americans would be trapped between the cliff face and automatic weapons fire. Sarah secured Captain Williams to the rope first, then helped Harrison into his climbing position. The system she had rigged would allow her to haul both men simultaneously while climbing herself, but it would require enormous physical strength and perfect coordination. Any mistake in the rope management would send all 3 of them falling to their deaths on the rocks below. "When I start climbing, don't look down," Sarah instructed Harrison. "Focus on the rock in front of you and trust the rope. If we're going to die tonight, we're going to die trying to get home." Harrison managed a weak smile despite their desperate situation. "I should have known when I recommended you for advanced training that you'd eventually do something completely crazy to save my life. Let's go home, Lieutenant." Sarah began the ascent just as the first Taliban fighters reached the cave entrance behind them. The initial shouts of surprise told her that the enemy hadn't expected to find the cave empty, and it would take them several crucial seconds to realize that their quarry was climbing the cliff face above them. Those seconds might mean the difference between life and death. The weight Sarah was pulling up the cliff was enormous. Her own body weight plus equipment, Harrison's weight plus his gear, and Captain Williams, who was dead weight on the rope. Her shoulders and arms screamed in protest as she pulled herself and both men up the nearly vertical rock face, but adrenaline and desperation gave her strength she didn't know she possessed. The first gunshots came when they were about 50 feet up the cliff. The Taliban fighters had discovered their escape route and were firing upward, but the darkness and the angle of the cliff face made accurate shooting nearly impossible. Sarah could hear bullets striking the rock around them, sending chips of stone cascading down toward the cave entrance. "Sarah, I can help more," Harrison called up to her. "My arms are fine. Just tell me what to do." "Use your hands to stay close to the rock face," Sarah replied, pulling them all up another 10 feet. "Don't try to climb. Just keep yourself and Williams from swinging away from the cliff. The rope system will do the work, but I need you to control the movement." Captain Williams regained consciousness halfway up the cliff face and immediately began to panic when he realized he was dangling hundreds of feet above the ground. His thrashing threatened to destabilize the entire rope system and pull all 3 of them off the mountain. "Williams, stay calm," Harrison commanded, using his military authority to cut through the pilot's panic. "We're getting you out of here, but you have to stay still. Don't fight the rope. It's the only thing keeping us alive." The pilot's training reasserted itself, and he forced his body to relax despite the terror of his situation. Sarah continued hauling them upward, her muscles burning with the constant strain, but the determination unwavering. They were more than halfway to the top of the cliff, and the gunfire from below was becoming less accurate as the distance increased. But Sarah's physical reserves were approaching their limit. The combination of the long infiltration, the fighting in the compound, and now the enormous effort of hauling two men up a cliff face was pushing her body beyond its normal capabilities. Her hands were cramping from gripping the rope, and her shoulders felt like they were on fire. "How much farther?" Harrison asked, sensing that Sarah was struggling with the enormous physical demands of the climb. "Maybe 60 feet, Sarah gasped, pausing to rest her burning muscles for a few seconds. "I can make it. We're all going to make it." The final section of the climb was the most difficult because Sarah's anchor point was directly above them, requiring her to haul both men straight up while climbing herself. The rope system was stretched to its limits, and she could hear the anchor hardware groaning under the strain. If any component of her improvised rigging failed, they would all fall to certain death. Sarah's world narrowed to the immediate physical demands of the climb. Pull, step up, pull, step up. Ignore the pain, ignore the exhaustion, ignore everything except the need to reach the top of the cliff and get her wounded teammates to safety. Her vision began to blur from exhaustion, and she had to pause repeatedly to rest her arms and hands. "Sarah, you're incredible," Harrison called up to her as they approached the final 20 feet of cliff face. "I don't know how you're doing this, but you're saving all our lives." "Just doing my job, sir," Sarah replied through gritted teeth, though they both knew that what she was accomplishing went far beyond any definition of duty or obligation. When Sarah's hand finally closed on the solid rock at the top of the cliff, she felt a surge of relief and triumph that almost brought tears to her eyes. She had done it. She had accomplished the impossible rescue and brought both men back from certain death or permanent captivity. But they still had to get back to friendly territory, and Captain Williams needed immediate medical attention. Sarah hauled both men up onto the narrow ledge at the top of the cliff, then immediately began packing her climbing equipment. They could still hear shouting and gunfire from the compound below, and she knew it was only a matter of time before the Taliban organized a pursuit force to track them across the mountains. "Can you walk 20 miles? Sarah asked Harrison as she helped him check his injured leg. "I'll crawl 20 miles if I have to," Harrison replied. "But Williams isn't going to make it that far without medical treatment. He's lost too much blood." Sarah examined the pilot's wounds in the light of her flashlight. Harrison was right. Captain Williams was in critical condition, and the physical demands of a long-distance infiltration across rough terrain would probably kill him. But there was no alternative. Staying on a mountain meant certain capture or death, and calling for extraction would bring helicopters into range of surface-to-air missiles. "We'll take turns carrying him," Sarah decided. "Move in short stages, rest frequently, and get him to the base hospital as quickly as possible. It's not ideal, but it's our only option." The journey back across 20 miles of hostile territory was a nightmare of physical endurance and tactical complexity. Sarah and Harrison took turns carrying the semi-conscious pilot, while the other provided security and navigation. They moved only at night, hiding during daylight hours in whatever concealment they could find in the rocky terrain. Captain Williams slipped in and out of consciousness during the journey, sometimes coherent enough to walk short distances with assistance, other times completely unconscious and requiring constant care. Sarah used most of her medical supplies, treating his wounds and trying to prevent him from going into shock, but she knew he needed surgery and blood transfusions that were far beyond her field capabilities. On the second night of their escape, they were forced to hide for 4 hours while a Taliban search party passed within 100 yards of their position. Sarah and Harrison lay motionless in a shallow depression between two boulders, with Captain Williams unconscious between them, barely breathing. The enemy fighters were using flashlights and calling to each other as they searched, clearly following some kind of trail or intelligence about the Americans' escape route. "They're tracking us," Harrison whispered when the search party had finally moved on. "Someone is providing them information about our movements." Sarah had reached the same conclusion. The Taliban pursuit was too organized and too accurate to be based on random searching. Either they had found physical evidence of the Americans' passage, or they were receiving intelligence from local sources who had observed their movement. Either way, the enemy was getting closer with each passing hour. We need to change our route, Sarah decided. Move away from the direct path to the base and try to throw them off our trail. It'll add distance, but it might keep us alive long enough to reach friendly territory. The detour took them through even more difficult terrain, forcing them to navigate rocky ravines and steep mountainsides while carrying an unconscious man. Sarah's physical reserves were almost completely exhausted, and Harrison was clearly struggling with his injured leg, but neither of them complained or suggested stopping. Captain Williams was depending on them, and failure would mean his death. On the morning of the third day, Sarah spotted the distinctive outline of American helicopters on the horizon. She immediately began signaling with her emergency radio, hoping the aircraft were close enough to receive her transmission. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Within minutes, the entire valley was filled with the sound of rotors as multiple aircraft converged on their position. The evacuation was completed under covering fire from Apache attack helicopters that had been scrambled as soon as Sarah's absence was discovered at the base. Captain Williams was immediately loaded onto a medical helicopter and rushed to the field hospital, while Sarah and Harrison were extracted by another aircraft that was heavily escorted by armed guards. The reception at the base was unlike anything Sarah had ever experienced. She had expected to be arrested for desertion and insubordination, but instead found herself surrounded by officers who wanted to hear every detail of her impossible mission. The successful rescue of 2 American prisoners from a heavily fortified enemy compound was being hailed as one of the most remarkable special operations achievements in military history. Colonel Webb was among the first to greet Sarah when she arrived at the base, and his expression was a mixture of admiration and disbelief. "Lieutenant Mitchell, what you accomplished should have been impossible. How did you manage to infiltrate that compound and extract 2 prisoners without any backup or support?" "I had the best possible motivation, sir," Sarah replied simply. "Commander Harrison would have done the same for any of us. Some promises are worth any risk to keep." The medical report on Captain Williams was cautiously optimistic. The pilot had lost a dangerous amount of blood and required multiple surgeries, but the doctors believed he would make a full recovery. Harrison's injuries were less severe and would heal completely with proper treatment. Both men owed their lives to Sarah's unwillingness to accept that their rescue was impossible. The official military response to Sarah's unauthorized rescue mission was complex and unprecedented. While her actions had clearly violated multiple regulations and chain-of-command protocols, the successful outcome made it impossible to treat her conduct as simple insubordination. After extensive review by senior officers, Sarah received both a formal reprimand for unauthorized action and a decoration for extraordinary heroism in combat. More importantly to Sarah, she received something that couldn't be awarded or taken away: the knowledge that she had kept her promise to never leave a teammate behind. When Harrison was captured, the military had written him off as an acceptable loss, but Sarah had refused to accept that assessment. Her loyalty to her team leader and her willingness to risk everything for his rescue had saved 2 American lives and demonstrated the true meaning of military brotherhood. Years later, when Sarah had been promoted to command her own special operations team, she would tell new recruits that the most important lesson she had ever learned came not from any training manual or classroom instruction, but from a night when she climbed an impossible mountain to keep an impossible promise. Some missions, she would tell them, are worth any sacrifice to complete because the bonds between soldiers are stronger than orders, regulations, or tactical assessments. Commander Jake Harrison recovered fully from his injuries and returned to active duty, eventually rising to become one of the most respected special operations officers in the military. Captain Williams also made a complete recovery and returned to flying missions, though he would never forget the woman who had risked everything to save his life when he was a stranger in need of help. But perhaps the most lasting impact of Sarah Mitchell's impossible rescue mission was the change it brought to military doctrine regarding prisoner rescue operations. Her success proved that even the most heavily defended enemy positions could be vulnerable to unconventional approaches, and that individual courage and determination could accomplish what large-scale operations could not. The story of the woman who climbed a mountain to save her team leader became part of special operations legend, told and retold in training facilities around the world as an example of what could be accomplished when loyalty, skill, and courage combined in service of an impossible mission. Sarah Mitchell had proved that sometimes the word impossible was just another challenge to overcome, and that the bonds between soldiers were strong enough to move mountains, literally.